Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. My name is Daniel Kovich. I have been working as an Alaska State Wildlife Police Officer for 13 years. I am stationed in the North Slope region and am responsible for an area that encompasses everything from the Brooks Range to the interior valleys. Most of my work is fairly straightforward: checking hunting licenses, investigating poaching complaints, responding to wildlife conflicts, conducting search and rescue operations when hikers or hunters don't return on time. This job keeps you on your toes, sharpens your mind, and most importantly, keeps you humble. This state finds a way to remind you just how small you really are. It was late September when the call came in. Dispatch radioed me around 9 in the morning while I was finishing up paperwork at the district office in Fairbanks. A hunting party had reported one of their members missing near the headwaters of the Chandalar River, about 160 miles northeast of where I was sitting. The missing man was named Marcus Henley, 42 years old, experienced outdoorsman from Anchorage. He'd been with two friends, both of whom claimed Marcus had wandered off from their camp the previous evening to check some game trails and never returned. They'd searched through the night, found nothing, and decided to hike out to get help when their sat phone wouldn't connect. The weather report wasn't encouraging. Early snow had already hit the high country, and temperatures were dropping fast at night. If Marcus was injured or disoriented, he didn't have much time. I grabbed my gear, called in a helicopter from a private operator we contract with, and was airborne within the hour. The pilot was a guy named Stevens, late 50s, been flying in Alaska longer than I'd been alive. We didn't talk much during the flight. He knew the drill, and I was already running through scenarios in my head, mapping out search patterns based on the coordinates the friends had provided. The landscape below us shifted from boreal forest to tundra as we gained elevation. Rivers carved through valleys like silver threads, and the mountains rose up in jagged rows that seemed to go on forever. There's a particular kind of silence you experience in a helicopter over that terrain. The mechanical thrum of the rotors becomes white noise, and everything outside the cockpit looks pristine and untouched, like you're the first person to ever see it. It's beautiful in a way that makes your chest tight. We landed in a clearing about a quarter mile from where the hunting party had set up their camp. Stevens kept the rotors spinning while I unloaded my pack, rifle, and emergency beacon. He'd wait there for 2 hours, and if I didn't return or radio, he'd head back for fuel and come get me in the morning. Standard protocol for this kind of operation. I gave him a thumbs up, ducked under the wash of the blades, and started hiking toward the coordinates. The camp was easy enough to find. 2 tents, a cold fire pit surrounded by stones, gear scattered in a way that suggested people had left in a hurry. I called out, announced myself, but got no response. The friends had obviously already hiked out like they said they would. I spent a few minutes looking around, checking for anything unusual. The tents were zipped shut, sleeping bags still laid out inside. A cooler sat near the fire pit, lid closed but not secured. Food was still inside, which meant they hadn't been worried about bears. That struck me as odd, but not alarming. Some people get careless. I found the trail the friends had mentioned, a faint game path leading northwest from the camp through a stand of stunted spruce trees. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I could see boot prints heading in both directions. Some were deeper, more deliberate, like someone walking with purpose. Others were shallower, almost dragging, like someone exhausted or injured. I followed them for about half a mile before they started to get strange. The prints began to overlap in ways that didn't make sense, Same boot treads, but some were facing backward, like Marcus had been walking in reverse. Then they'd turn again, heading off at sharp angles into the brush where no trail existed. I've tracked plenty of lost hikers over the years, and disorientation is common, especially at night. But this felt different. The pattern was too erratic, too deliberate in its chaos. It reminded me of something I'd seen once in a training manual about hypothermia victims. In the final stages, people sometimes exhibit what's called paradoxical undressing. They feel overheated, start stripping off clothes, and wander in circles. But Marcus's friends hadn't mentioned anything about finding discarded clothing. I radioed Stevens, told him I was going to push further in and might need that extra time. He acknowledged, said he'd monitor the frequency. The air was getting colder as the sun arced lower toward the mountains. Shadows stretched long across the tundra, and the light took on that flat, gray quality that makes distance hard to judge. I kept following the prints, marking my own trail with small cairns of stones every 100 yards so I could find my way back. About an hour in, I found the first piece of clothing. A fleece jacket, dark green, hung on a low branch like someone had carefully placed it there. I checked the pockets, found a wallet with Marcus Henley's ID and credit card still inside. That was wrong. Nobody takes off their jacket in this cold and leaves their wallet behind. I bagged the jacket, noted the location on my GPS, and kept moving. The prints continued, but they were changing again. Now they were deeper, heavier, like Marcus was carrying extra weight. But there was no second set of prints, no drag marks, nothing to suggest he'd picked up gear or game. Just his boots, pressing harder into the soft earth with each step. The trees began to thin out as I climbed higher, giving way to open tundra dotted with low shrubs and moss. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow from the peaks above. That's when I saw the second piece of clothing. His shirt, long-sleeved thermal, laid flat on a boulder like someone had smoothed out all the wrinkles. Next to it was one of his boots, laces still tied, positioned upright as if he'd simply stepped out of it. The other boot was nowhere in sight. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of the scene. The shirt was dry, no mud or tears. The boot showed no signs of struggle or damage. Everything was too neat, too arranged. I radioed Stevens again, told him what I was seeing. He asked if I wanted him to call in additional units. I said no, not yet. I wanted to understand what I was looking at before bringing in more people. Looking back now, that was probably a mistake. But in the moment, I convinced myself this was still a search and rescue, not a recovery. I convinced myself Marcus might still be alive, just confused and hypothermic. The sun was getting low, maybe an hour of good light left. I pushed on, following the single line of boot prints that continued across the tundra. They led me to a small depression in the ground, a natural bowl formed by centuries of wind and rain, and that's where I found him. Marcus Henley was standing in the center of the depression, completely motionless, facing away from me. He was naked from the waist up, barefoot, wearing only his pants. His skin looked pale, almost gray in the failing light. I called out to him, identified myself, told him I was there to help. He didn't respond, didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. I approached, slowly, calling his name, keeping my voice calm and level. When I got within about 20 feet, I could see he was shivering violently, his whole body shaking in rhythmic spasms. But he wasn't moving otherwise, wasn't trying to warm himself or seek shelter. Just standing there, staring at something I couldn't see. I came around to his side, trying to get a look at his face, and that's when I realized something was very wrong. His eyes were open, but empty. Not dead, not unconscious, just absent. Like nobody was home behind them. His lips were moving slightly, forming shapes without sound. I reached out to touch his shoulder, and the moment my hand made contact, he jerked away with such sudden violence that I stumbled backward. He spun to face me, and I saw that his chest and arms were covered in scratches, deep parallel lines that looked self-inflicted. His fingernails were torn and bloody. I tried talking to him again, told him I had warm clothes, food, water, that we needed to get him out of there. He looked directly at me for the first time, and I felt something cold slide down my spine. His expression was wrong. Not afraid, not confused, just absolutely blank. Then he spoke, and his voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the wind. He said, "They're still waiting." I asked who was waiting. He didn't answer, just turned back around to face the direction he'd been staring before. I moved in front of him, tried to block his view, but his eyes looked straight through me like I wasn't there. I pulled out my emergency thermal blanket, tried to wrap it around his shoulders, but he shrugged it off without looking at me. I was starting to realize I needed immediate medical evacuation. This wasn't hypothermia alone. Something else was happening here. I radioed Stevens, told him to get the helicopter up here now, gave him my coordinates. He said he was already spooling up, had heard the concern in my earlier transmissions and decided to get closer. I could hear the distant thump of rotors echoing off the surrounding hills. I stayed with Marcus, kept trying to engage him to get any kind of response, but he just stood there, shivering and silent. That's when I noticed the other prints, not boot prints this time, but something else. They formed a wide circle around the depression, maybe 30 feet in diameter. At first, I thought they might be caribou tracks, but the spacing was wrong, too deliberate. They were evenly spaced, perfectly symmetrical, like something had walked a precise perimeter around this spot. I followed them with my eyes, counting the impressions. 12 distinct sets, all the same size, all pressed into the soft ground with identical depth. I looked up at Marcus, then out at the surrounding tundra. We were completely exposed here, no trees, no cover, nothing but open ground stretching in every direction. Whatever made those prints had approached this spot, circled it, and left. But there was only one set of tracks leading away, heading north toward a rocky ridge about half a mile distant. And those tracks were strange too far apart for walking, too close together for running. Something in between, like whatever made them had been moving with a loping, unnatural gait. The helicopter crested the ridge, and I waved my arms to guide Stevens in. The downwash from the rotors kicked up a storm of dead grass and dust. I had to hold on to Marcus to keep him from stumbling, and that's when I felt how cold he was. His skin was like ice, temperature way below what should be survivable. I wrapped him in the thermal blanket despite his resistance and half-carried, half-dragged him toward the helicopter. Stevens had the side door open, reaching out to help pull Marcus inside. It took both of us to get him situated in the back. I climbed in behind him, and Stevens didn't waste time. We were airborne in seconds, banking hard to the south. I kept trying to get Marcus to respond, checking his pulse, his breathing, anything. His vitals were weak but present. His eyes stayed open, staring at the floor of the helicopter. The flight to the nearest medical facility took 40 minutes. Marcus didn't speak again. Didn't move except for that constant shivering. The medics met us on the landing pad, got him on a gurney and rushed him inside. I gave them what information I could, described the scene, the condition I found him in. They nodded, made notes, and disappeared behind automatic doors. I spent the next 3 hours answering questions and filing reports. The two friends who'd been with Marcus showed up at the hospital around midnight. They looked exhausted and scared. I walked them through everything, asked them to go over what happened before Marcus disappeared. Their story matched what they'd told dispatch. Marcus had left camp around 8 p.m. to check game trails. He'd taken his rifle and headlamp but no other gear. When he didn't return by midnight, they'd started searching. Found nothing. No response to their calls, no light from his headlamp. They'd assumed he'd gotten turned around in the dark and decided to wait until morning. When dawn came and there was still no sign, they'd hiked out for help. I asked if Marcus had been acting strange before he disappeared. They exchanged looks, and the older one, a guy named Patrick, admitted that Marcus had been quiet all day. Not depressed or angry, just distant. Said he'd been staring at the surrounding hills a lot, like he was looking for something specific. The other friend, Ben, added that Marcus had barely eaten dinner and kept asking about the area's history, whether any old camps or settlements were nearby. 3 days later, I got a call from the hospital. Marcus had been transferred to a psychiatric facility in Anchorage. He'd started speaking again, but nothing he said made sense. He claimed he'd been following lights, that something had called him out into the tundra. He described figures standing in a circle, watching him, but couldn't say what they looked like or what they wanted. The doctors classified it as a severe psychotic break, possibly triggered by hypothermia and stress. They kept him sedated and under observation. I didn't hear anything more for about 2 weeks. Then dispatch called me in, said they'd received another missing person report from the same general area. Different hunting party, different victim, but similar circumstances. A woman this time, 36 years old, experienced hunter, wandered away from camp in the evening and didn't return. Her companions had searched through the night, found her the next morning standing in an open area, unresponsive. Most of her clothes removed despite near-freezing temperatures. I flew out with Stevens again, this time with 2 additional troopers. We found the woman exactly where her friends described. Same blank stare, same violent shivering, same scratches on her exposed skin. And around her, pressed into the soft ground, was that same circle of prints. 12 sets, evenly spaced, perfectly symmetrical. Leading away to the north, toward that same rocky ridge were those loping, unnatural tracks. We evacuated her immediately, didn't spend any extra time at the scene. But I took photographs of everything, measured the prints, collected soil samples. Back at the office, I pulled up satellite imagery of the area, started marking the locations where both incidents had occurred. They were less than 3 miles apart, both in open areas with good visibility, both within line of sight of that northern ridge. I requested permission to do a helicopter survey of the ridge itself. My supervisor approved it but told me to take someone with me. I brought Stevens and a wildlife biologist named Sarah Chen, who'd worked in the region for years. We flew low over the ridge, scanning for caves, dens, anything that might explain the tracks. What we found made me wish we'd left it alone. On the north face of the ridge, sheltered from view and accessible only by a narrow trail, was a series of stone structures, not natural formations, but deliberately stacked rocks forming low walls and circles. Some were partially collapsed, others intact, all arranged in a pattern that mirrored the circle of prints we'd found around the victims. Sarah identified them immediately as traditional Inupiaq hunting blinds, probably centuries old, used by indigenous hunters to observe caribou migrations. But there was something else there, too. In the center of the largest stone circle, someone had placed fresh bones. Not animal bones, but arranged like the animal remains I'd heard about in other reports. They formed a pattern, a spiral leading inward, and at the center was a small pile of items: a hunting knife, a compass, a headlamp, and a satellite phone, none of them damaged, all placed with care. Sarah took photographs while I examined the items more closely. The satellite phone still had battery life. I turned it on, checked the call log. The last number dialed matched Marcus Henley's phone. The call had been placed the night he disappeared, about 2 hours after he'd left his camp. It had connected, lasted for 17 seconds, then disconnected. I checked Marcus's phone records later. He'd never mentioned receiving a call that night. We documented everything, collected the items as evidence, and left the ridge. I filed a detailed report, included all the photographs and measurements, recommended that the area be closed to hunting until we could determine what was happening. My supervisor read it, thanked me for the thorough work, and told me the area would remain open. Budget constraints, political pressure, the usual reasons. But he did agree to post warnings about the potential for disorientation and hypothermia. I couldn't let it go. Something about those stone circles, the way the items were arranged, the precision of it all, kept nagging at me. I spent my off days researching the area's history, talking to elders from the local indigenous communities, reading old expedition reports. Most of what I found was standard stuff: traditional hunting grounds, seasonal camps, migration routes. But buried in a university archive, I discovered something that made my chest tighten. In 1923, a geological survey team had worked in that exact region. Their final report included a brief mention of what they called unusual stone formations on the northern ridge. They'd documented the structures, noted their probable age and purpose, but also included a strange addendum. 3 members of their team had experienced severe disorientation while working near the ridge. All 3 had wandered away from their camp at night, been found the next morning in various states of undress and hypothermia, unable to clearly explain what had happened. The team had attributed it to altitude sickness and cold stress, packed up early, and left the region. The report included a handwritten note from the team leader, barely legible in the scanned document. It said they'd observed lights on the ridge several nights in a row, moving in patterns that didn't match aurora activity or any known natural phenomenon. The team had decided not to investigate further, concerned for their members' safety. I tried to bring this to my supervisor's attention, showed him the historical report, explained the similarities. He listened patiently, then reminded me that my job was to respond to current incidents, not investigate century-old mysteries. He suggested I was spending too much time on this case, that maybe I needed to take some leave, clear my head. I nodded, agreed, and stopped talking about it at work. But I didn't stop thinking about it, and I didn't stop monitoring reports from that region. Over the next 6 months, there were 4 more incidents. All hunting parties, all experienced outdoors people, all exhibiting the same behavior. Wandering away from camp, found standing in open areas, unresponsive and hypothermic, surrounded by those circular prints. 2 of them recovered after psychiatric treatment. 2 others never regained full cognitive function, still in care facilities, still talking about lights and figures and something waiting. I went back to the ridge one more time, alone, during a brief window of good weather in late spring. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, didn't file a flight plan, just chartered a small plane with a pilot who didn't ask questions. We landed on a gravel bar near the base of the ridge, and he agreed to wait for 4 hours while I hiked up. The stone circles were still there, undisturbed by winter weather, but the bones were gone, and in their place was something new. A small cairn of stones, perfectly stacked, with a flat piece of slate on top. Someone had scratched marks into the slate, symbols I didn't recognize. I photographed them, measured the cairn, and tried to understand what I was looking at. I stayed there for about an hour, sitting on a flat rock, looking out over the tundra below. The wind was gentle that day, carrying the smell of thawing earth and new growth. Nothing seemed threatening or unusual, just an ancient hunting site, slowly being reclaimed by time and weather. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was waiting for me to leave so it could continue whatever it had been doing for centuries. I hiked back down, got in the plane, and flew back to civilization. I never returned to that ridge, and I never filed a report about that final visit. What would I say? that I'd found some scratched symbols and felt uncomfortable. That wouldn't help anyone. Marcus Henley was released from the psychiatric facility after 8 months of treatment. He moved to the lower 48, last I heard. Doesn't talk about what happened, refuses interviews, just wants to forget. The woman we found after him recovered enough to return to her normal life, but gave up hunting entirely. She won't discuss the incident, hangs up if reporters call. The warnings are still posted in that region, small signs near common access points advising hunters to stay alert for disorientation and hypothermia symptoms. They don't mention the stone circles, the prints, or the pattern of incidents. Just standard safety information that most people ignore. I still work this district, still respond to calls in that general area, but I pay attention now in ways I didn't before. I notice when people come back from that region with stories about lights they can't explain. I listen when someone mentions feeling watched, feeling pulled toward something they couldn't identify. And I keep a file, unofficial and off the books, documenting every incident that matches the pattern. Last month, a trapper called in from a cabin about 20 miles west of the ridge. He'd been checking his trap lines at dawn when he saw something moving across the tundra in the distance. He described it as several figures walking in single file, evenly spaced, moving with what he called an unusual gait. He'd watched them through binoculars for several minutes before they disappeared behind a rise. He said they weren't caribou, weren't wolves, weren't anything he recognized. He just wanted someone to know, in case it meant something. I thanked him for the report, filed it with the others, and added another pin to my map. The pins form their own pattern now, a slow spiral working outward from that ridge, each incident adding to the shape. I don't know what it means. I don't know if it means anything at all. Maybe it's just coincidence, just random chance in a region where people push themselves too hard and nature pushes back. But sometimes, late at night when I'm reviewing case files and the office is empty, I pull up that photograph of the scratched symbols on the slate. And I wonder if there's some kind of warning, some message left by people who understood what lived on that ridge long before we showed up with our GPS units and satellite phones and absolute certainty that we could explain everything. I'm still waiting for dispatch to call about another incident in that area. When they do, and they will, I'll respond the same way I always do. I'll grab my gear, charter a helicopter, and fly out to wherever someone needs help. I'll do my job, file my reports, and probably bring someone back alive, but changed in ways they'll spend years trying to understand. And if I have time, if the weather's clear and I'm already up there, I might fly over that ridge one more time. Not to land, not to investigate, just to look. To see if those stone circles are still there, still waiting, still serving whatever purpose they've served for longer than any of us can measure. Because some things in Alaska aren't meant to be understood. They're just meant to be respected, avoided, and remembered when you're standing alone on the tundra and wondering why you suddenly feel like you should be somewhere else. The hardest part of this job isn't the cold, or the isolation, or even the occasional violence you encounter in remote areas. It's the waiting, the hours you spend sitting in your truck with the engine running parked at some trailhead or pullout, hoping someone you're looking for will walk out of the woods alive. That's what kills you slowly, that helpless waiting while your mind cycles through every possible scenario, most of them bad. My name is Sarah Vance. I've been a wildlife trooper for 11 years, working out of the Kenai Peninsula region. Before that, I spent 6 years as a state trooper in Soldotna, so I'm not new to the difficult calls or the strange situations that come with working in Alaska. But there are some cases that stay with you differently than others. Cases where all your training and experience don't prepare you for what you find. This is one of those. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in late October. Dispatch patched through a woman named Linda Merrick, who owned a small fishing lodge on the upper Kenai River. She was calling about one of her seasonal workers, a young guy named Tyler Hoff, who'd been living in one of the staff cabins since May. According to Linda, Tyler hadn't shown up for his shift in 3 days, which was completely unlike him. She'd checked his cabin, found his truck still parked outside, but Tyler was gone. All his belongings were still there, wallet, phone, even his jacket. But no Tyler. I took down the details, told her I'd drive out that afternoon to take a look. The lodge was about 40 minutes from my office, accessible by a gravel road that wound through dense spruce forest before opening up along the river. I'd been there before on routine checks, knew Linda as a straight shooter who wouldn't call unless she genuinely thought something was wrong. If she said Tyler's disappearance was unusual, I believed her. The weather was typical for late October, overcast and cold with that damp chill that works its way through your clothes no matter how many layers you wear. The leaves were mostly down, and the forest had that bare, exposed look that makes everything seem more visible and somehow more hidden at the same time. I pulled into the lodge around 2 in the afternoon, parked next to Linda's pickup near the main building. Linda came out to meet me before I even had my door fully open. She was in her late 50s, had run the lodge with her husband for almost 20 years before he passed. She looked tired and worried, which wasn't her usual demeanor. We shook hands, and she walked me through what she knew, which wasn't much. Tyler had worked the evening shift on Friday, seemed fine, maybe a bit quiet, but nothing alarming. Saturday morning, he didn't show up for breakfast, which the staff usually ate together. She'd figured he was sleeping in, but when he missed his shift that afternoon, she went to check on him. His cabin was one of 4 small structures set back from the main lodge. Simple one-room buildings with a bed, small table, and basic amenities. When Linda knocked and got no answer, she'd used her master key to check inside. Everything looked normal, bed made, dishes washed and stacked by the sink, no signs of struggle or disturbance, but Tyler was gone, and his truck keys were sitting on the table next to his phone, which was plugged in and fully charged. She'd asked the other staff members if they'd seen him. Nobody had. One of the other workers mentioned that Tyler had been taking a lot of walks lately, heading out into the woods for hours at a time. Linda had figured he was just enjoying the outdoors, which wasn't unusual for the kind of people who came to work at remote lodges. But 3 days without contact, without his vehicle or phone, that was different. I asked Linda to show me the cabin. We walked down a narrow path through the trees, our boots crunching on fallen spruce needles. The cabin was exactly as she'd described, neat and organized, everything in its place. I looked through his belongings with her permission, found nothing unusual. Clothes folded in a small dresser, toiletries lined up in the bathroom, a few books on the bedside table. One of them was a field guide to Alaskan wildlife, bookmarked about halfway through the section on bears. What caught my attention was a notebook sitting on the table next to his phone. I opened it, found pages of handwritten observations about the surrounding forest. Tyler had been documenting his walks, noting animal tracks, plant species, weather conditions, all written in careful, precise handwriting. The entries were dated, starting in early September and continuing through the previous Friday. I read through them carefully, and as I got to the more recent entries, the tone started to change. The earlier notes were straightforward observations. Saw a cow moose with calf near North Trail. Found fresh bear scat, probably black bear. Weather turning colder. First frost last night. But around mid-October, the entries became more focused on something specific. He kept mentioning a particular area about 2 miles upstream from the lodge, a bend in the river where the forest thickened. He wrote about feeling watched there, about hearing sounds that didn't match any animal he could identify. In one entry from October 20th, he'd written, "Something is circling out there. Haven't seen it directly, but I can track its movement by the way birds go silent." The last entry was from Friday evening, dated around 10 p.m. It was just 2 lines. "Going back tonight to confirm. If I'm right about the pattern, it should be there." Nothing after that. I asked Linda if she knew what Tyler had been interested in upstream. She shook her head, said she'd noticed him heading that direction on his time off but hadn't thought much of it. I borrowed the notebook, told her I was going to check out that area, and asked if anyone at the lodge wanted to come with me. She called over one of the other seasonal workers, a guy named Marcus, who'd known Tyler fairly well. Marcus was in his mid-20s, worked maintenance around the lodge. He told me Tyler had mentioned finding something interesting upstream, some kind of wildlife pattern he wanted to document, but hadn't gone into details. Marcus had offered to go with him a few times, but Tyler had said he preferred to observe alone, didn't want to disturb whatever he was tracking. Marcus said Tyler had seemed excited about it, not worried or scared, just genuinely interested in whatever he'd discovered. I grabbed my day pack from the truck, made sure I had my radio, flashlight, and basic survival gear. Marcus and I headed out around 3 p.m., following a game trail that ran parallel to the river heading upstream. The light was already starting to fade, that early darkness of late October, making everything feel compressed and urgent. We moved at a good pace, Marcus leading since he knew the trails better than I did. The forest was quiet in that heavy way that makes you aware of your own breathing. No birds, no small animals rustling in the underbrush, just the sound of the river and our footsteps. After about 40 minutes, we reached the area Tyler had written about in his notebook. The river bent sharply here, forming a deep pool before continuing downstream. The trees grew thick and close, mostly spruce with some birch mixed in, their white bark standing out against the darker trunks. Marcus stopped at the edge of the clearing near the riverbank and pointed to a spot across the water. "Tyler spent a lot of time over there," he said. "There's a fallen tree that makes a good observation point. I came with him once, about 3 weeks ago. I looked where he was pointing and saw the log, a massive spruce that had toppled sometime in the past, creating a natural bridge partway across the river before angling back toward the bank. You could walk out on it pretty far, get a good vantage point of both the river and the surrounding forest." We made our way around to the other side, picking through the brush until we reached the fallen tree. The first thing I noticed was fresh boot prints in the soft mud near the tree. They were the right size for Tyler, and they led out onto the log. I followed them carefully, testing my weight with each step. The bark was slick with moss in places, and the whole structure creaked ominously, but it held. About 20 feet out, where the log was widest and flattest, I found where Tyler had been sitting. There were small indentations where he'd placed items on the log, and caught in the bark was a scrap of fabric that matched the description of the jacket he'd been wearing according to Linda. But what made me stop and call Marcus over was what I found carved into the wood. Someone had used a knife to scratch a series of marks into the log, all recent based on the fresh wood exposed. They weren't random. They formed a pattern, a series of circles connected by straight lines, radiating out from a central point. Marcus climbed out to join me, looked at the carving, and went quiet. I asked him if Tyler had mentioned doing this. He shook his head. "Tyler wasn't the type to carve on things," he said. "He was always talking about leaving no trace, respecting the environment." I took photos of the carving and the surrounding area. Then we continued searching. About 50 feet downstream from the log, Marcus found something in the brush. He called me over, and when I pushed through the branches, I saw what had caught his attention. Tyler's jacket, the one Linda had mentioned, was hanging on a low branch. Not snagged or caught, but deliberately placed there, arms spread wide like someone had carefully arranged it. I bagged the jacket, checked the pockets. Empty except for a small piece of paper folded multiple times. I unfolded it carefully, found more of Tyler's handwriting. This note was different from the neat observations in his notebook. The letters were larger, more urgent, written quickly. It said, "They move in patterns. 3 nights in a row now. Same route, same timing. Not animals, not people, something else. Need to see them up close." Marcus read over my shoulder and took a step back. What the hell was he tracking? He asked. I didn't have an answer. I radioed back to Linda, told her we'd found some of Tyler's belongings, but no sign of Tyler himself. I asked her to check if any of the lodge guests had reported anything unusual in the past few weeks, strange sounds, sightings, anything that might correlate with what Tyler had been observing. She said she'd ask around and get back to me. The light was fading fast now, that brief twilight shrinking down to nothing. I made the decision to continue searching for another hour, at least check the immediate area more thoroughly. Marcus agreed, though I could tell he was getting uncomfortable. We split up, staying within shouting distance, and worked our way through the forest on both sides of the river. I was about 100 yards downstream from the fallen tree when I found the first circle. It was made of stones, small smooth river rocks arranged in a perfect circle about 6 feet in diameter. The stones were too uniform, too deliberately placed to be natural. In the center of the circle was a small pile of organic material, leaves, moss, and what looked like pieces of bark, all arranged in a cone shape. I called Marcus over and we stood there looking at it. He asked if I thought Tyler had made it. I said I didn't know, but it matched the pattern he'd carved into the log. We found 2 more circles within the next 20 minutes, both identical in size and construction, both with that same cone of organic material in the center. They were positioned in a line, each one about 40 feet from the next, leading deeper into the forest away from the river. The forest was almost completely dark now. I pulled out my flashlight and Marcus did the same. I should have called off the search, should have marked the location and come back in the morning with more people and better light. But something about those circles, about the deliberate pattern they formed, made me want to keep going. I told Marcus he could head back if he wanted. He hesitated, then said he'd stay with me. We followed the line of circles for another 10 minutes. The 4th circle was different. It was larger, maybe 10 feet across, and the stones were bigger, some of them requiring 2 hands to lift. But it was what was inside that made us both stop. Instead of organic material, the center held items that clearly didn't belong there. A watch, a pair of glasses, a small digital camera, and what looked like a GPS unit. All of them arranged in a careful pattern around a flat stone in the very center. I knelt down next to the circle, careful not to disturb anything, and examined the items with my flashlight. The watch was stopped at 10:47. The GPS unit's screen was cracked, but still faintly glowing, showing a position marker that matched our current location. The camera was a basic point-and-shoot model, a few years old. I picked it up carefully, turned it over. There was a piece of medical tape on the back with a name written in marker, Jennifer Hale. Marcus asked if I knew who that was. I said no, but something about it felt familiar. I radioed Linda again, asked if she'd ever had a guest or worker named Jennifer Hale. There was a long pause before she responded. When she did, her voice sounded strained. Jennifer Hale had been a guest at the lodge 2 years ago, September of that year. She'd come alone, spent a week fishing and hiking. On her last day, she'd gone for a walk and never came back. Search and rescue had spent 10 days looking for her, found nothing. The case was still open, listed as missing presumed dead. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I asked Linda if Jennifer had mentioned being interested in anything specific during her stay. Linda said she'd been particularly interested in the wildlife, had spent hours walking the trails with her camera. She'd mentioned to Linda that she thought she'd seen something unusual in the forest, something that moved in a way that didn't match any animal she knew. Linda had assumed she meant a bear or moose. I looked at the other items in the circle: the watch, the glasses, the GPS. I asked Marcus to take photos of everything while I called for backup. This had just become something bigger than a missing person case. I needed crime scene techs, more troopers, proper documentation of everything we'd found. While I was on the radio coordinating the response, Marcus kept his light trained on the circle. After I finished, he said quietly, "Sarah, there's something else here." He was pointing to the edge of the circle where the stones met the forest floor. Pressed into the soft earth was a print, not a boot print this time, but something else. It was roughly the size of a human hand, but the proportions were wrong. The fingers were too long, the palm too narrow, and there was what looked like an extra digit where the thumb should be. I photographed it from multiple angles, trying to identify what could have made it. It didn't match any animal I'd seen in 11 years of working in these woods. The print was deep, pressed firmly into the ground, and there were more of them leading away from the circle, forming a trail that headed further into the darkness. I told Marcus we were done, that we needed to get back to the lodge and wait for the other units to arrive. He didn't argue. We marked the location with bright orange flagging tape and started back toward the river. The walk back felt longer, the forest pressing in around us in ways it hadn't on the way out. Every snap of a branch, every rustle in the undergrowth made us stop and listen. We were about halfway back when Marcus grabbed my arm and pointed off to our left. Through the trees, maybe 50 yards away, I could see lights moving. Not flashlights or headlamps, but something softer, more diffuse, like phosphorescence or bioluminescence. There were 3 of them moving in a line, bobbing slightly as they went. They were too high off the ground to be from someone walking, maybe 8 or 9 feet up. I called out, identified myself as a state trooper, told whoever it was to make themselves known. The lights stopped moving. For a long moment, everything was silent. Then they began moving again, but faster now, and they were coming toward us. I pulled my sidearm, kept my flashlight trained in their direction. Marcus was backing away, his own light sweeping wildly through the trees. The lights got closer, and I could start to make out shapes behind them. Tall, thin shapes that moved with an unsettling fluidity. Like they weren't quite touching the ground, I shouted another warning, raised my weapon. The lights stopped again, about 30 feet away now, close enough that I should have been able to see details, see what was carrying them. But my flashlight beam seemed to slide off them, to fail to illuminate anything solid. Then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, the lights went out. Complete darkness, except for our flashlights. I swept my beam across the area where they'd been, saw nothing but trees and undergrowth. Marcus was breathing hard next to me, asking what the hell that was. I didn't answer because I didn't have an answer. We made it back to the lodge around 8 p.m. Linda had coffee ready and a fire going in the main building. 2 other trooper units had arrived while we were in the woods, along with the search and rescue coordinator I'd worked with before, a guy named Bill Patterson. I briefed them on everything we'd found, showed them the photos, explained about the circles and the items and those lights we'd seen. Bill listened carefully, making notes, not interrupting. When I finished, he asked if I'd requested forensics. I said they were on their way from Anchorage, should arrive by morning. He nodded, then asked the question I'd been dreading. "Do you think Tyler Hoff is still alive?" I said I didn't know. Everything we'd found suggested he'd gone deeper into the forest following something he'd been tracking. Whether that something had harmed him, or whether he'd gotten lost or injured, I couldn't say. but the discovery of Jennifer Hale's belongings changed the situation. If there was a connection between her disappearance 2 years ago and Tyler's now, we might be looking at something more serious than a lost hiker. Bill organized search teams to go back out at first light. We'd do a proper grid search of the area around those circles, bring in dogs, check every inch of the forest. For now, everyone would stay at the lodge, get some rest, and prepare for a long day tomorrow. I tried to sleep but couldn't. I kept thinking about those lights, about the way they'd moved toward us and then vanished, about the prints around the circle that didn't match any animal I knew, about Tyler's note, not animals, not people, something else. Around 3 a.m., I gave up and went to the lodge's common room where several other troopers were still awake, drinking coffee and reviewing maps. Marcus was there too, sitting by the window, staring out at the darkness. I sat down next to him and asked if he was doing okay. He said he couldn't stop thinking about Tyler, about how excited he'd been about whatever he was tracking. Marcus said Tyler had told him a few days before he disappeared that he was close to understanding the pattern, that he just needed a few more nights of observation to confirm his theory. I asked what theory. Marcus shrugged. He wouldn't say exactly, just that if he was right, it would change how we understood wildlife behavior in Alaska. He kept talking about intelligence, about intentional patterns that suggested something beyond instinct. At dawn, we deployed 6 teams into the forest. Each team had 4 people, a mix of troopers and search and rescue volunteers. We worked in expanding grids from the location of the circles, moving slowly, checking every depression, every dense thicket, every fallen tree. The dogs picked up a scent near the 4th circle and led us northeast, away from the river and deeper into unmarked territory. We followed for about 2 miles. The forest here was older, the trees bigger, the underbrush thicker. The dogs kept stopping and circling, confused, like the scent was dispersing or being masked by something. The handler, a woman named Sheila who'd worked with search dogs for 15 years, said she'd never seen them act this way. The trail was fresh, definitely human, but something was interfering with their ability to track it consistently. We pushed on for another hour until we reached a small clearing. The dogs went wild, barking and pulling at their leads, but refusing to enter the clearing itself. Sheila had to physically hold them back. I approached the clearing carefully, weapon drawn, and stopped at the tree line. The clearing was about 40 feet across, roughly circular, and completely devoid of vegetation. The ground was bare earth, packed hard like it had been compressed by heavy weight or repeated traffic. In the center was another stone circle, but this one was massive, maybe 20 feet in diameter, made of stones that must have weighed hundreds of pounds each. And in the center of that circle was Tyler Hoff. He was sitting cross-legged, facing away from us, absolutely motionless. He was wearing the same clothes Linda had described, but they were filthy, covered in mud and what looked like moss. I called out to him. No response. I called again, louder, identified myself. Still nothing. I advanced into the clearing, the other team members fanning out behind me. As I got closer, I could see that Tyler's hands were resting on his knees, palms up, in what looked almost like a meditative posture. His head was tilted back slightly, face toward the sky. When I reached him and came around to see his face, I felt my stomach drop. His eyes were open but vacant, pupils dilated so far that almost no iris was visible. His skin was pale, almost gray, and covered in a fine layer of something that looked like pollen or dust. I checked his pulse, slow but steady. He was breathing, shallow but regular. I called for the medical team and tried to get Tyler to respond. I touched his shoulder, spoke his name, even tried gently shaking him. Nothing. He was completely unresponsive, locked in that same position. The medics arrived with a stretcher. It took 4 of us to move him because his muscles were rigid, locked in place. We had to carry him out of the clearing in the same cross-legged position he'd been sitting in. The dogs still wouldn't enter the clearing, and neither would anyone who didn't absolutely have to. There was something about that place that felt wrong, felt heavy, like the air itself was thicker there. We got Tyler back to the lodge and loaded him into a medical helicopter that had been standing by. Linda watched from the porch as they lifted off, heading for the hospital in Anchorage. She looked older than she had the day before, worn down by worry and confusion. The forensics team spent 3 days processing the scene. They documented the circles, collected the items we'd found, took soil samples, analyzed the strange prints. Their report was thorough and completely unsatisfying. The items from the 4th circle were confirmed to have belonged to Jennifer Hale. The prints didn't match any known animal. The dust on Tyler's skin was identified as spores from a fungus that typically grew on dead wood, but in concentrations that shouldn't have been possible on a living person. Tyler spent 2 weeks in the hospital. He eventually regained consciousness but had no memory of anything after leaving the lodge that Friday night. The last thing he remembered was walking up toward the river, intending to check the area one more time. Everything after that was blank. The doctors ran every test they could think of. Neurologically, he was fine. Physically, he was fine. But something had happened to him in those 3 days, something that left no measurable mark but changed him in ways that were obvious to anyone who knew him. Linda said he wasn't the same when he came back to collect his things. He moved differently, talked differently, like he was relearning how to interact with the world. He quit his job at the lodge, told Linda he couldn't stay in Alaska anymore, that he needed to be somewhere else. He thanked her for everything and left. Last I heard, he was working at a library in Oregon, living a quiet life far from the woods. The case file on Jennifer Hale was updated to include the recovery of her belongings, but it's still listed as unsolved. We never found her body, never determined what happened to her. The working theory is that she wandered off, got disoriented, and died of exposure somewhere in that forest. Her belongings being arranged in that circle is explained as possible scavenger activity or the actions of a disturbed individual who found her remains. It doesn't explain the other items in the circle, items that didn't belong to Jennifer, but nobody wants to dig deeper into that. I've been back to that area 3 times since then, always during daylight, always with other troopers. The circles are still there, the stones undisturbed. The clearing where we found Tyler is exactly as we left it, still barren, still wrong feeling. I've never seen those lights again, and I've never found another one of those strange prints. But I know they're out there, moving in patterns we don't understand, for purposes we can't explain. The lodge is still operating. Linda keeps it running, though she's more careful now about where she lets guests hike. She's had a few more workers over the years, but she tells all of them the same thing. Stay on the marked trails. Don't go out after dark. And if you see lights moving through the forest that don't look right, come back immediately and tell her. Most people laugh when she says it, think she's playing up the wilderness mystique for the tourists. But the ones who work there long enough, the ones who spend enough time in those woods, they start to understand. They see things at the edge of their vision, hear sounds that don't quite match anything familiar, feel that sensation of being watched by something that has no interest in making itself known. I still have Tyler's notebook. I've read through it dozens of times, trying to understand what he'd figured out, what pattern he'd seen that made him so certain he was on the verge of some great discovery. But his observations, detailed as they are, don't reveal anything conclusive. Just notes about movement and timing, about the way certain areas of the forest seemed more active at certain times, about sounds and signs that suggested intelligence without proving it. There's one entry near the end that I keep coming back to. It's dated October 24th, the day before he disappeared. He wrote, "I think they know I'm watching. The pattern changed tonight, adjusted to account for my presence. This isn't random, this is intentional. Tomorrow I'll know for sure." Whatever he learned in that clearing, whatever he saw or experienced during those 3 missing days, it's locked inside his mind somewhere beyond the reach of conscious memory. And maybe that's for the best. Maybe some knowledge isn't meant to be brought back, isn't meant to be shared. Maybe the forest keeps its own secrets, and the price of learning them is higher than any of us should be willing to pay. I'm still working this region, still responding to calls about missing hikers and unusual wildlife sightings. Every time I get a call from somewhere near that section of the river, I feel my chest tighten just a little. And every time I drive past the turnoff to Linda's lodge, I think about Tyler sitting in that clearing, surrounded by stones arranged in patterns older than human understanding, learning something that cost him pieces of himself he'll never get back. The forest is still there, still quiet, still hiding whatever it was that drew Jennifer Hale and Tyler Hoff into its depths. And somewhere in that darkness, those lights are still moving, still following patterns we were never meant to see. Every trooper has that one radio call that changes how they see the job. The call that makes you realize there are things happening out in the wilderness that don't fit into any training manual or procedure guide. For me, it came on a Saturday afternoon in March, during that brief window when the days are getting longer, but winter still has the state locked in its grip. I'm James Carver, been working as a wildlife trooper for 15 years, stationed in the interior region around Fairbanks. My territory covers thousands of square miles of boreal forest, frozen rivers and mountains that most people will never see. I've pulled bodies from ice, tracked down poachers, rescued stranded snowmobilers, and dealt with more bear encounters than I can count. I thought I'd seen everything this job could throw at me. The call came in around 2 p.m. A pilot named Ron Kellerman had been doing a routine mail and supply run to some of the remote cabins scattered along the Yukon River drainage when he spotted something unusual. He'd circled back twice to confirm what he was seeing before radiating it in. According to Ron, there was a cabin about 80 miles northwest of Fairbanks, accessible only by air or a brutal overland trek in winter, that was showing signs of recent activity. Smoke from the chimney, snowmobile tracks around the property, the works. That wouldn't normally warrant a call to law enforcement, except Ron knew for a fact that the cabin's owner had died 4 months earlier. Harold Nevin, 73 years old, lifelong Alaskan, had passed away in a hospital in Anchorage after a stroke. Ron had flown Harold's body out himself back in November, helped arrange the transport. The cabin should have been empty, locked up and abandoned until Harold's estate got sorted out. But someone was there. Someone was living in a dead man's cabin in one of the most remote corners of Alaska, and Ron wanted to know if that was something I should check out. I told him yes, definitely, and asked if he could take me out there. He said he was already planning on it, had fuel and daylight enough for one more run. I grabbed my gear and met him at the airstrip 30 minutes later. Ron flew a Cessna 185, the workhorse of Bush, Alaska, modified with oversized tires for landing on rough terrain. We took off heading northwest, following the Tanana River before breaking off toward the higher country. The landscape below was an endless expanse of white, broken only by dark lines of spruce forest and the occasional glint of a frozen creek. No roads, no power lines, no signs of human presence except for the rare cabin tucked into some protected valley. Ron pointed out landmarks as we flew, showing me where Harold's cabin sat in relation to other remote homesteads. The nearest neighbor was over 20 miles away, an old trapper named Ellis, who only came out to his cabin during fur season. Beyond that, nothing but wilderness for 100 miles in every direction. Harold had chosen his solitude carefully. We spotted the cabin from about 5 miles out. Smoke was definitely rising from the chimney, a thin, gray line against the white sky. As we got closer, I could see the snowmobile tracks Ron had mentioned, fresh lines in the snow forming loops around the cabin and leading off toward the tree line. Someone had been busy. Ron circled the cabin twice at low altitude. No one came out to see what the plane was doing, which struck me as odd. Out here, any aircraft was an event, something worth investigating. But whoever was in Harold's cabin either didn't care or didn't want to be seen. Ron found a decent landing spot about a quarter mile from the cabin, a frozen creek bed that was flat and wide enough for the Cessna. He set us down smooth, killed the engine, and we sat there for a moment in the sudden silence. I asked Ron to stay with the plane while I approached the cabin on foot. He didn't argue, said he'd keep the radio on and the engine warm in case we needed to leave in a hurry. I gathered my pack, checked my sidearm, and started the walk toward Harold's place. The snow was deep but packed firm enough to walk on without snowshoes. The air was cold, probably 20 below, and absolutely still. No wind, no sound except the crunch of my boots and the occasional crack of a tree contracting in the cold. I approached from the south, using the tree line for cover, watching the cabin for any sign of movement. Harold's place was a classic Alaskan cabin, single-room construction made from local logs, metal roof to shed snow, small windows with heavy shutters. A covered porch wrapped around the front, and I could see a cord of firewood stacked neatly against the wall. The snowmobile, a newer Yamaha, was parked near the porch, partially covered with a tarp. Everything looked well-maintained, lived in, normal. I called out from about 50 feet away, identified myself as a state trooper, asked whoever was inside to come out and talk. No response. I called again, louder this time, making it clear I wasn't leaving until I got answers. The cabin door opened. The man who stepped out onto the porch was not Harold Nevin. He was younger, maybe mid-40s, with a thick beard and weathered skin that spoke of years in the elements. He wore insulated coveralls and heavy boots, and he stood there with his hands visible, making no threatening moves. But his expression was strange, not hostile or afraid, just blank, like he was looking through me rather than at me. I asked his name. He said it was Peter. Just Peter, no last name offered. I asked what he was doing in Harold's cabin. He said he was staying there, keeping the place up, making sure it didn't fall into disrepair over the winter. I asked if he was family, friend, someone Harold had given permission. Peter shook his head slowly. He said Harold had invited him. I pointed out that Harold had been dead for 4 months. Peter nodded, said he knew that. I asked him to explain what he meant about Harold inviting him if Harold was dead. Peter was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Harold invited me before he left, told me I could stay as long as I needed." That could have been true. Harold might have offered the cabin to someone before he went to Anchorage for medical treatment, before he knew he wouldn't be coming back. But something about Peter's demeanor, about the way he stood there so still and empty, made me uneasy. I asked if he had any documentation, any proof that Harold had given him permission to be there. Peter went back inside without a word. I waited on the porch, hand near my weapon, watching the door. He came back out carrying a piece of paper, folded and worn. He handed it to me and I opened it carefully. It was a handwritten note, dated September of the previous year. The handwriting was shaky but legible. It said, "Peter has my permission to use this cabin as needed. He is a friend and can be trusted. Harold Nevin." The signature matched the one I'd seen on Harold's official documents. I asked Peter where he'd met Harold, how long they'd known each other. Peter said they'd met years ago, that Harold had helped him when he needed it, and they'd stayed in touch. He was vague on details, and when I pressed him, he just repeated that Harold had been a friend. I radioed Ron, told him the situation seemed legitimate, but I wanted to check inside the cabin, make sure everything was in order. Ron acknowledged, said to take my time. I asked Peter if I could come in and look around. He stepped aside and gestured for me to enter. The interior of the cabin was exactly what you'd expect from a man like Harold. One large room with a wood stove in the center, a bed in one corner, a small kitchen area along one wall, shelves full of books and supplies. Everything was clean and organized. Too clean, actually. There wasn't the usual accumulation of a winter's worth of living, no dishes stacked by the sink, no clothes draped over furniture, no personal items scattered around. It looked almost staged, like someone had set it up to look lived in without actually living there. I walked the perimeter of the room, checking the shelves, the storage areas, the spaces under the bed. I found Harold's rifle mounted above the door, his tools hanging neatly on the wall, his collection of old maps and journals on a shelf by the bed. But I didn't find any of Peter's belongings. No extra clothes, no personal effects, no gear that would suggest someone had been staying here for any length of time. I asked Peter where his things were. He said he traveled light, that he didn't need much. I pointed out that he'd have to have supplies, food, fuel for the snowmobile, basic necessities. He said Harold had left plenty, that he was just using what was already here. That was plausible. Harold had always kept his cabin well stocked, but it didn't explain the complete absence of any personal trace. I was about to ask more questions when I noticed something on the table near the window. A journal, leather-bound and old, sitting open to a page covered in Harold's distinctive handwriting. I walked over and read the entry. It was dated October 15th of the previous year, about a month before Harold's death. It described a visitor, someone Harold called the Quiet One, who had arrived at the cabin unannounced. Harold wrote that this person seemed lost, not geographically but in some deeper way, and that he'd offered them shelter for as long as they needed it. The entry continued, describing conversations with this visitor, though Harold noted that the person rarely spoke, preferring to sit by the fire and listen. Harold wrote that there was something peaceful about their presence, something that made the long winter nights feel less lonely. The entry ended with a line that made me pause. I think this one has been walking for a very long time. I wonder if they'll ever find what they're looking for. I looked at Peter, who was standing by the door, watching me read. I asked if he was the person Harold had written about. Peter nodded slowly. I asked where he'd been walking from, where he was trying to get to. Peter said he didn't remember where he'd started, and he wasn't sure where he was going. He just knew he needed to keep moving, and Harold's cabin had been a good place to rest. That should have been a red flag. Someone who doesn't remember where they came from, who can't articulate where they're going, living alone in a remote cabin in the dead of winter. But Peter didn't seem dangerous or unstable. He seemed tired, deeply and profoundly tired, like someone who'd been carrying a weight for too long and had finally found a place to set it down. I asked if he had any identification. He shook his head. I asked if he'd registered the snowmobile. He said it was Harold's, not his. I checked the registration sticker on the machine later, confirmed it was indeed registered to Harold Nevin. I asked Peter how he was getting supplies if he wasn't flying out or taking the snowmobile to any settlements. He said he wasn't getting supplies, he was just using what Harold had left. I did an inventory of the cabin's stores. Canned goods, dried foods, fuel for the stove and the generator. Based on what was there and what appeared to have been consumed, Peter's story checked out. He'd been living off Harold's supplies, using them carefully, making them last. If he continued at his current rate, he could probably make it through to spring without needing resupply. But none of this explained who Peter was or why he was really there. I told him I'd need to verify his story, check if there were any missing person reports that matched his description, confirmed that he wasn't wanted for anything. He said he understood, that he'd cooperate with whatever I needed to do. His calm acceptance of the situation was almost more unsettling than if he'd been defensive or evasive. I took his photo with my phone, noted his physical description, and radioed the information back to dispatch. While I waited for them to run checks, I asked Peter more about his relationship with Harold. He said Harold had found him walking along the river one day, brought him back to the cabin, fed him, let him stay. They'd spent weeks together, mostly in silence, occasionally sharing a meal or a story. Harold had never asked where Peter came from, and Peter had never volunteered the information. When I asked why he'd left and then come back after Harold died, Peter said he hadn't known Harold had died. He'd been walking again, following some internal compass that he couldn't explain, and he'd ended up back at the cabin. It was only when he got there and found it empty, found Harold's journal and the letter giving him permission to stay, that he understood Harold was gone. So he'd stayed, felt like it was what Harold would have wanted. Dispatch came back with nothing. No missing person reports matching Peter's description, no warrants, no criminal history they could find without a last name or date of birth. I asked Peter for more identifying information, anything that might help narrow the search. He said he didn't remember his last name, didn't remember his birthday, or where he'd been born. He said a lot of things had gotten fuzzy over the years, that only the walking felt clear. I should have taken him in right then, should have insisted he come back to Fairbanks for a proper evaluation. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way he spoke about Harold with genuine affection. Maybe it was the fact that he clearly wasn't causing any trouble, wasn't bothering anyone, was just existing in this remote corner of the world. Or maybe it was something in his eyes, something that suggested taking him away from this place would be worse than leaving him there. I made a decision that probably violated half a dozen protocols. I told Peter he could stay for now, but I'd be checking in regularly, and if anything changed, if any complaints came in, or if his story didn't hold up, I'd have to bring him in. He thanked me quietly, said he appreciated the understanding. I left him there, walked back to Ron's plane, and we flew back to Fairbanks in silence. Ron asked if everything was okay. I said I thought so, that the guy seemed legitimate enough, just someone Harold had helped out who was paying it back by maintaining the cabin. Ron seemed satisfied with that explanation. He said Harold had been the type to help people, that it made sense he'd have friends nobody else knew about. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about Peter. I ran every search I could think of, checked missing person databases going back years, looked for any John Does or unidentified individuals that matched his description. Nothing. It was like he'd appeared out of nowhere, a ghost with no past and no connections to the world most of us inhabit. I flew back out to Harold's cabin 3 more times over the next 2 months. Each time, Peter was there, going about the quiet business of surviving the winter. He'd cut more firewood, repaired some damage to the roof, kept the place in good order. He was always polite, always cooperative, never gave me any reason to question his right to be there beyond the simple strangeness of his presence. On my last visit, in early May, when the snow was starting to melt and the ice was breaking up on the rivers, I asked Peter what he'd do when summer came. He said he didn't know, that he'd probably start walking again. I asked where he'd go. He said wherever felt right, that he'd know when he got there. I asked if he ever thought about trying to remember his past, about finding out who he was before he started walking. Peter was quiet for a long time, staring out the cabin window at the melting landscape. Then he said something that's stayed with me ever since. Some people spend their whole lives trying to figure out where they belong. I already know I don't belong anywhere. The walking is where I exist. The stopping is just resting between steps. I left him there that day, and I haven't been back since. Ron does flyovers occasionally, says the cabin looks abandoned now. No smoke from the chimney, no tracks in the snow come winter. Peter moved on, started walking again, following whatever internal map guides him through the wilderness. I filed a final report on the situation, noted that the cabin appeared to have been maintained by a transient individual with Harold Nevin's permission, that no laws had been broken and no further action was required. Harold's estate was settled, the cabin transferred to a distant relative who's never visited it and probably never will. As far as I know, it sits there empty now, waiting for the next lost soul to find shelter in its walls. But sometimes I wonder about Peter, about all the others like him who might be out there walking through the vast, empty spaces of Alaska. People who've become untethered from normal life, who exist in the margins between settlements, following routes only they can perceive. The wilderness is big enough to hide countless stories, countless individuals who've chosen to step outside the boundaries of conventional existence. I've heard similar reports over the years from other troopers, other pilots, other people who spend time in the remote areas. Sightings of individuals who appear and disappear, who seem to be traveling without destination, who interact with the occasional cabin owner or pilot, but leave no lasting trace. No one talks about it much because what would you say? That there are ghosts walking the wilderness? That some people have become so disconnected from society that they've essentially become part of the landscape? What bothers me most isn't that Peter was there, or that I let him stay. It's that I never figured out who he was. Every person has a history, a family, a place they came from. But Peter seemed to exist outside of that framework, like he'd somehow slipped through the cracks of recorded human existence and found a different way to be. I still have the photo I took of him on my phone, stored in a folder I rarely open. Sometimes, late at night, I pull it up and look at his face, trying to see something I missed, some clue that would explain who he was and why he ended up at Harold's cabin. But the photo reveals nothing. Just a weathered man with tired eyes, standing in the doorway of a remote cabin, looking at something beyond the camera's frame. Harold's journal is in evidence storage, logged and filed in case it's ever needed for anything. I read through it completely before storing it, found 3 other entries about Peter spread across several months. Harold wrote about their conversations, or rather his conversations while Peter listened. He described Peter as a man walking off the edges of his own map, and noted that he seemed most at peace during the darkest part of winter, when the nights were longest and the silence most complete. In his final entry about Peter, written just days before Harold left for Anchorage and the hospital where he'd die, Harold wrote, "I told him he could stay as long as he needed. I don't think he'll need long. People like him aren't meant to stay anywhere. They're meant to keep moving, keep searching, even if they don't know what they're searching for. I hope he finds it, whatever it is, and I hope when he does it gives him the peace that stopping never could." I think about that sometimes, about the idea that some people are fundamentally incompatible with stillness, with settlement, with all the things most of us take for granted as necessary for a meaningful life. Maybe Peter wasn't lost at all. Maybe he'd found exactly what he needed in that constant motion, in the act of walking itself rather than in any destination. The last time I flew over Harold's cabin, it was midwinter, and the whole landscape was locked in deep snow. The cabin looked small and lonely from the air, a tiny human mark on an incomprehensibly vast wilderness. I wondered if Peter ever came back, if he might return to that place during another circuit of whatever route he follows through the wild country. I don't expect I'll ever see him again. Alaska is too big, and people like Peter are too good at disappearing when they want to. But I think about him whenever I fly over that region, whenever I respond to a call about someone spotted walking alone through country where walking alone doesn't make sense. I think about all the maps we draw, all the lines and boundaries and named places, and how there might be whole other geographies that exist in the spaces between our markers. Harold understood that, I think. That's why he helped Peter, why he gave him permission to use the cabin, why he never asked the questions most people would have asked. Harold had spent enough time in the wilderness to know that it operates by different rules than civilization, that the things we consider necessary and important often matter very little in places where survival is the only real currency. I'm still a trooper, still covering the same territory, still responding to the same types of calls, but I see things differently now. When I get a report of someone spotted in an unlikely place, someone who shouldn't be where they are, I consider the possibility that they're exactly where they need to be, just traveling along routes the rest of us can't see. The wilderness keeps its secrets, and the people who become part of it keep theirs too. Peter is out there somewhere, walking between places that have names toward destinations that don't. And somewhere behind him is a trail of temporary stops, brief shelters, moments of rest in cabins like Harold's where someone understood that the walking was what mattered, not the stopping. I hope he's still walking. I hope whatever he's looking for stays just far enough ahead to keep him moving, because I think Peter was right. Some people don't belong anywhere. They belong everywhere and nowhere, and the only way they can exist is by never staying long enough for the world to pin them down and demand they explain themselves. That's what the wilderness offers that civilization can't. The freedom to be unexplained, unaccounted for, unmapped. And maybe that's what Harold saw in Peter, what made him offer shelter without asking for answers. He recognized someone who'd chosen, or been chosen by, a different way of being in the world. The case is officially closed. No crime was committed, no one was harmed, no laws were broken. Just a dead man's cabin and a walking man's temporary shelter, meeting for a winter before both went their separate ways into the vastness of Alaska. It shouldn't bother me. It should just be one of those strange little incidents that happen in remote places, easily explained and easily forgotten. But I can't forget it. I can't forget Peter's face or the way he talked about walking, or the complete absence of fear in his eyes when I told him I might have to take him in. He wasn't afraid because being taken in, being forced back into the world of names and addresses and documentation, wouldn't have changed who he was. He'd have walked out of whatever facility they put him in and kept going, following that internal compass that the rest of us have lost or never had. Maybe that's what really bothers me. Not that I couldn't figure out who Peter was, but that I understood on some level the appeal of what he was doing. The idea of walking away from everything, of becoming so unattached that you're essentially invisible to the systems and structures that govern most people's lives. In a state as big as Alaska, in wilderness as vast and indifferent as this, you could absolutely disappear if you wanted to. You could walk forever and never run out of places to walk. I don't think I'll ever do it. I have a life, a job, responsibilities that keep me anchored. But knowing it's possible, knowing there are people like Peter who've actually done it, changes how I see everything else. The boundaries feel more arbitrary now. The rules feel more optional. The whole constructed world we live in feels thinner, more temporary, like it's all just an agreement we've made that could be unmade if we chose. Harold knew that. He'd lived long enough on the edge of the wilderness to understand that civilization is a thin veneer, easily stripped away, easily abandoned. That's why he could offer Peter shelter without needing to know who he was or where he came from. Because in the context of that cabin, in that remote corner of Alaska, Those things didn't matter. What mattered was survival, shelter, and the human kindness of offering both to someone who needed them. I drive past the turnoff to the airstrip sometimes, the one Ron uses for his supply runs. I think about asking him to take me out to Harold's cabin one more time, just to see if Peter came back, just to know. But I never do. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some questions are better left unasked, and some people are better left walking, wherever their feet take them, following paths the rest of us will never understand. The thing about working remote areas is that you learn to trust your instincts before you trust what you're seeing. Your gut will tell you something's wrong long before your brain catches up. And out here, that split-second difference can be what keeps you alive. I learned that lesson early, but I didn't really understand it until the winter of 2019, when I got the call about the Talbert hunting camp. My name is Michael Wade. I've been with Alaska Wildlife Troopers for 9 years, working the territory around the Kuskokwim River and the western interior. It's hard country, the kind of place where winter lasts 8 months and the summer mosquitoes can bleed you white in an hour. The people who live out here are either born to it or running from something, and most of them prefer to handle their own problems without involving law enforcement. So when someone calls us, it usually means something has gone seriously sideways. The call came from a satellite phone on a Wednesday morning in late January. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Carl Talbert, and he was trying very hard to sound calm, while clearly being anything but. He said he needed a trooper at his hunting camp as soon as possible, that something had happened to one of his party members, and could we please send someone right away. When I asked what kind of something, he got quiet for a few seconds before saying he'd rather explain in person. That's never a good sign. People who are vague about emergencies are usually vague because what they need to explain doesn't make sense, even to them. But Carl gave me GPS coordinates, confirmed he had 2 other people with him who could verify whatever needed verifying, and said he'd have a landing area marked for a helicopter. I told him I'd be there within 2 hours. The weather was cooperating for once, clear skies and relatively warm for January, only about 10 below zero. I chartered a helicopter from a pilot named Jackson who'd flown me on dozens of remote calls. We lifted off from McGrath and headed northwest, following the Kuskokwim until we picked up a tributary that would take us to Carl's coordinates. The land below was an unbroken expanse of white, broken only by the dark threads of frozen waterways and the occasional stand of spruce. Carl's camp came into view about 90 minutes into the flight. It was set up on a rise overlooking a frozen lake. 3 large canvas tents arranged in a triangle around a central fire pit. I could see 4 figures standing near the fire, watching us approach. Jackson brought us down on the lake ice, which was plenty thick this time of year, and I grabbed my gear and headed for shore. Carl met me halfway, a big man in his 50s with a gray beard and the kind of weathered face you get from decades in the elements. He shook my hand, but his grip was weak, distracted. Behind him were 2 other men, both younger, both looking like they hadn't slept in days. Carl introduced them as his son Derek and his friend's kid, a guy named Mitchell. I asked where the 4th member of their party was. Carl's expression went carefully blank. He said that was why he'd called. The 4th member, a man named Robert Chen, was in the medical tent. He was alive but not responsive, and Carl needed me to see him before we discussed what had happened. I followed Carl to the largest tent, the other 2 men trailing behind in silence. Inside the tent was warm, a propane heater running full blast. Robert was lying on a cot, covered with multiple sleeping bags, staring at the tent ceiling. His eyes were open and moving, tracking things I couldn't see, but when I spoke to him he didn't react. I checked his pulse, his breathing, his pupils, Everything seemed normal physically, but it was clear something was very wrong mentally. I asked Carl what had happened. He took a breath, glanced at Derek and Mitchell like he needed their permission to speak, then started talking. They'd been at the camp for 5 days, hunting moose and caribou in the surrounding area. The hunting had been decent. They'd taken 1 moose between them and were processing the meat. Everything had been normal until 2 nights ago. Robert had taken the evening shift watching their meat cache, making sure wolves or other scavengers didn't get into it. The cache was about a 1/4 mile from camp, situated near a small creek that provided good visibility. Robert had his rifle, a radio, and a thermos of coffee. Standard procedure for an overnight watch in country like this. Carl said they'd established a check-in schedule. Every 2 hours, Robert would radio in to confirm everything was fine. The first 2 check-ins went normally. Robert reported no activity, said it was quiet, cold, but manageable. His 3rd check-in, scheduled for 2 a.m., never came. Carl waited 30 minutes, tried raising Robert on the radio, got no response. He woke Derek and Mitchell, and the 3 of them headed for the meat cache with flashlights and weapons. When they got there, Robert was sitting on the ground about 20 feet from the cache, his rifle laid across his lap, staring into the darkness. He didn't respond when they called his name, didn't react when they approached. He was just sitting there, eyes wide open, looking at something they couldn't see. His radio was smashed on the ground next to him, pieces scattered in the snow. They'd tried everything to get through to him, shook him, yelled at him, even threw snow in his face. Nothing worked. He just sat there with that blank stare, occasionally blinking but otherwise completely unresponsive. Eventually, they'd carried him back to camp, gotten him into the medical tent, and tried to warm him up. That was 36 hours ago, and he hadn't changed. Still staring, still unresponsive, still alive but somehow absent. I asked if there were any signs of an attack, animal or human. Carl said no, nothing. The meat cache was undisturbed, no tracks in the snow except their own and Robert's. No blood, no signs of struggle, nothing to indicate what had happened. Robert didn't have any injuries, no head trauma, no frostbite beyond the minor exposure you'd expect from sitting in the cold for an hour or so. I asked if Robert had said anything before this happened, if he'd reported seeing or hearing anything unusual during his earlier check-ins. Carl shook his head. Said Robert had been in good spirits, joking around during the day, looking forward to getting back home to his family. There was no indication anything was wrong until he simply stopped responding at 2 a.m. I went back outside and walked the perimeter of the camp, looking for anything unusual. The snow around the tents was heavily trampled from their activities, but beyond that immediate area everything was pristine. I could see their trail leading to and from the meat cache, a packed-down path through the knee-deep snow. I decided I needed to see the cache itself. Carl, Derek, and I made the walk together, Mitchell staying behind to watch Robert. The terrain was open tundra studded with low willows, easy walking despite the snow. The meat cache was exactly as Carl had described, a simple frame structure they'd built from local materials, covered with tarps to protect the meat from birds and weather. The moose quarters were still there, frozen solid, untouched. I examined the area carefully, looking for any clue about what had happened to Robert. The spot where they'd found him sitting was obvious, a compressed area in the snow with a clear outline of his body. His broken radio was still there, pieces scattered in a rough circle around the sitting spot. I picked up the largest piece, looked at the damage. It hadn't just broken, it had been destroyed deliberately, crushed with considerable force. I asked Carl if Robert could have smashed it himself. Carl said he supposed so, but he couldn't imagine why. The radio was their lifeline, their only way to communicate with the outside world. Destroying it made no sense. I agreed, but the evidence was clear. Someone had crushed that radio, and Robert was the only person who'd been there. I looked out from Robert's sitting position, trying to see what he'd been looking at. The view was unremarkable, just more tundra stretching away to the tree line about half a mile distant. The frozen creek wound through the snow, a darker line against the white. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed out of place. It was just empty wilderness under a gray sky. We walked back to camp in silence. I was already planning the evacuation, figuring Robert needed immediate medical attention and probably psychiatric evaluation. Whatever had happened to him, it was beyond anything I could address in the field. But before I could arrange the helicopter pickup, Derek asked if I'd talk to Mitchell alone. He said Mitchell had seen something the night they found Robert, something he hadn't wanted to mention in front of Carl. I found Mitchell in his tent, sitting on his sleeping bag, staring at his hands. He was younger than I'd initially thought, maybe mid-20s, and he looked scared. I asked him what he'd seen. He was quiet for a long moment, then started talking in a low, rushed voice like he needed to get it out before he lost his nerve. He said that when they'd been walking to the meat cache that night, when they'd been about halfway there, he'd seen lights. Not flashlights or headlamps, but something else. They were out on the tundra, maybe a mile away, moving in a pattern that didn't make sense. Rising and falling, spreading out and coming back together. Always in motion, but never getting closer or farther away. He'd pointed them out to Carl and Derek, but by the time they'd looked, the lights were gone. He'd figured he'd imagined them, just the aurora or reflection from their own lights playing tricks. But then when they'd found Robert sitting there with that blank stare, Mitchell had looked out toward where he'd seen the lights. And they were there again. Closer this time. Close enough that he could see they weren't natural. They had structure, intention, like they were searching for something. He'd tried to get Carl's attention, to show him, but Carl had been focused on Robert. By the time Mitchell looked back, the lights were gone again. He said he'd been too freaked out to mention it, didn't want to sound crazy, but he hadn't been able to stop thinking about them. The way they moved, the way they seemed to be looking for something, it had reminded him of searchlights, but organic somehow, alive. I asked Mitchell to describe them more specifically. He struggled, said they were pale, almost white, but with a hint of blue or green. They didn't illuminate the ground beneath them, didn't cast beams like normal lights. They just existed, floating in the darkness, moving with purpose. He said there had been at least 6 of them, maybe more, and they'd been coordinated, moving in relation to each other like they were parts of a larger whole. I thanked Mitchell for telling me and said I wanted to stay at the camp overnight to see if these lights appeared again. Mitchell looked horrified at the suggestion, but I explained I needed to understand what was happening before I could file an accurate report. If there was something out there causing this, I needed to document it. Carl wasn't happy about the delay in evacuating Robert, but he understood. We arranged for Jackson to come back the following morning, and I settled in for the night. I set up my own tent at the edge of the camp, positioned so I had a clear view of the tundra in the direction Mitchell had indicated. I told the others to maintain their normal routine as much as possible, to act like it was just another night. Dinner was a quiet affair, everyone lost in their own thoughts. Robert remained in his tent, still staring, still unresponsive. Carl tried feeding him, managed to get some water down, but Robert showed no sign of awareness. It was like his body was functioning on autopilot while his mind was somewhere else entirely. As darkness fell, I positioned myself outside my tent with thermal imaging gear and a camera with night vision capability. The temperature was dropping fast, probably down to 20 below by the time full dark arrived. The sky was clear, stars sharp and bright, no aurora activity. Perfect conditions for seeing anything unusual. The camp settled into silence. Carl and Derek were in their tent, Mitchell in his. I could hear the occasional sound of the propane heater running in Robert's tent, but otherwise nothing. Just the vast quiet of the Alaskan wilderness in winter, a silence so complete it seemed to have weight. The lights appeared around midnight. Mitchell had been right about them being impossible to describe accurately. They came from the north, moving low over the tundra, and they didn't behave like any natural or artificial light source I'd ever seen. They pulsed gently, like breathing, and they moved with fluid grace that reminded me of jellyfish swimming through deep water. There were 7 of them, spread out in a loose formation, sweeping back and forth across the landscape. Through the thermal imager, they showed up as cool spots, actually colder than the surrounding air, which made no sense. Light generates heat, but these seemed to absorb it. They were searching for something, that much was clear. The pattern was too systematic, too deliberate to be random. I started filming, making sure to capture as much detail as possible. The lights moved closer, still maintaining their search pattern, until they were about half a mile from camp. Then they stopped, hovering in place, and I got the distinct impression they'd found what they were looking for. They began moving again, but this time they were coming directly toward our position. I stood up, hand on my weapon, watching them approach. They covered the distance faster than anything moving at ground level should have been able to, and as they got closer I could see they weren't lights in the traditional sense. They were more like tears in reality, places where something else was showing through. The cold they emanated was intense. I could feel it from 100 yards away, a cold that had nothing to do with weather. The lights reached the camp perimeter and stopped, arrayed in a semicircle around us. They pulsed in unison now, creating a rhythm that I felt in my chest more than heard. I called out to the others, told them to stay in their tents, that I was handling it. But my voice sounded weak and unconvincing even to me. One of the lights detached from the formation and drifted toward Robert's tent. I moved to intercept it, positioned myself between it and the tent, but it simply drifted around me like I wasn't there. It touched the tent wall, and the fabric dimpled inward like something was pressing against it from the inside and outside simultaneously. The light pulsed brighter, and I heard a sound from inside the tent. Robert was screaming. Not words, just a raw sound of absolute terror that cut through the night like a blade. I pulled open the tent flap and saw Robert thrashing on the cot, finally responsive, but in the worst possible way. His eyes were locked on something in the corner of the tent, something I couldn't see, and he was screaming and screaming and screaming. The light outside pulsed once more, then retreated, rejoining the formation. All 7 lights hung there for another moment, then simply ceased to exist, winking out of existence without dimming or fading. One moment they were there, the next they weren't, and the sudden absence left a void that felt heavier than their presence had. I rushed to Robert's side. He was conscious now, but barely coherent, babbling about them coming back, about how they'd found him, about how he couldn't let them see him again. Carl and Derek burst into the tent, followed by Mitchell, everyone talking at once, trying to understand what was happening. I got Robert to focus on me, got him to slow down his breathing, to try to explain what he meant. Between gasps, he told us about the night he'd been watching the cache. He said the lights had come, had surrounded him, and he'd felt them looking into him, searching through his memories and thoughts like someone rifling through files. He said he'd smashed the radio because they'd told him to, not with words but with direct instruction planted in his mind. They'd wanted him isolated, unable to call for help. He said they'd been looking for something specific, some piece of information or memory, and they'd been thorough. He described the sensation of having his mind picked apart, examined, and then carefully put back together but wrong somehow, rearranged in ways he couldn't quite identify. He said he'd been conscious the whole time, aware but unable to move or speak, while they searched through everything that made him who he was. When they'd finished, they'd left him there, and he'd retreated into some deep part of his mind where they couldn't reach, where he could hide until they were gone. He'd stayed there, unresponsive to the external world, until they'd come back tonight. And somehow their return had pulled him back to the surface, forced him to be present again. I asked Robert if he knew what they'd been looking for. He shook his head, said he didn't know, but he was terrified they'd come back because they hadn't found it. He said they'd be back, that they always came back until they found what they were searching for. His certainty was absolute and chilling. We evacuated the camp at first light. Jackson arrived with the helicopter, and we made 2 trips to get everyone out. Robert was stable enough to travel, but still in shock, flinching at shadows, constantly looking over his shoulder. I filed a report that included everything I'd witnessed, attached the video footage and thermal imaging data, and waited for the inevitable questions. The official response was exactly what I'd expected. The footage was analyzed and deemed inconclusive, possibly weather phenomena or equipment malfunction. Robert was evaluated and diagnosed with acute stress reaction, possibly triggered by isolation and the harsh environment. The whole incident was classified as a medical emergency with no criminal or unusual elements requiring further investigation. But I've seen those lights twice more since then, both times in remote areas, both times behaving the same way. Searching, systematic, purposeful. I've talked to other troopers who've seen similar things, though most of them won't put it in official reports. We share information quietly, keep track of sightings, try to identify patterns. What we've found isn't comforting. The lights appear in winter, always in remote areas, always when someone is alone or nearly alone. They seem drawn to isolation, to people who've separated themselves from the larger group. And the people they encounter, the ones who survive the experience, they're all changed. Not physically, but in subtle ways that are hard to quantify. They become more withdrawn, more prone to anxiety, like they're carrying a weight they can't explain. Robert never went back to Alaska. He moved to the lower 48, got a job in a city, surrounded himself with people and light and noise. When I called to check on him a year after the incident, he said he was doing better, but that he still couldn't sleep with the lights off. He said darkness reminded him of being searched, of those lights moving through his mind like fingers through files. Carl sold his hunting camp equipment and took up fishing instead, restricting himself to areas within easy reach of settlements. Derek won't go into the wilderness at all anymore, claims he's gotten too old for camping. Mitchell left Alaska entirely. Last I heard, he was working on a ranch in Montana, where the horizons are wide and you can see anything approaching from miles away. I'm still working, still covering the same territory, still responding to calls in remote areas. But I'm more careful now about being alone in the dark. I maintain contact, check in regularly, make sure someone always knows where I am. And when I'm out in the field at night, I watch for those lights, for that telltale pulsing glow that means something is searching. Because that's what they are, those lights, searchers, looking for something specific, something they need, moving through the darkness with inhuman patience and precision. What they're looking for, I don't know. Why they need it, I can't guess. But I know they're still out there, still searching, still occasionally finding someone alone in the dark and taking the time to look through everything they are. The worst part isn't seeing the lights. It's wondering what they'd find if they ever chose to search through me. What memories or knowledge or piece of information would they consider valuable enough to take? And whether I'd ever get it back, or if it would just be gone, leaving a hole in my mind that I'd spend the rest of my life trying to fill without ever knowing what I'd lost. That's the real horror of the wilderness. Not that it can kill you, though it can. Not that it's vast and indifferent, though it is. But that it contains things that operate by rules we don't understand, pursuing goals we can't comprehend. And sometimes those things notice us. Sometimes they decide we have something they need. And when they do, there's nothing we can do except endure it and hope we come out the other side, still recognizing ourselves. I keep Robert's file on my desk, marked closed but never quite forgotten. Inside is my incident report, the medical evaluations, the video footage that supposedly shows nothing conclusive. And clipped to the back is a note I found in Robert's tent after we evacuated, written in his handwriting but not dated or signed. It just says, "They're looking for a name. They'll keep searching until they find whoever has it. I hope they never do." I don't know what name, or whose name, or why it matters, but every time I see those lights in the distance, moving with purpose through the darkness, I think about that note. And I wonder if they'll ever find what they're looking for, or if they'll just keep searching forever, pulling apart minds and memories, leaving changed people in their wake, always getting closer to whatever they seek. The wilderness doesn't give up its secrets easily, and maybe that's for the best. Maybe some questions shouldn't be answered. Maybe some searches should never succeed. All I know for certain is that the lights are still out there, still moving through the winter darkness, and somewhere someone is alone, about to discover they have something those lights want to see. There's a difference between being lost and being taken. Lost means you made a mistake, took a wrong turn, got disoriented. Taken means something else decided where you were going, and you didn't have much say in the matter. I've dealt with both in my career, but only once did I encounter something that made me question which category I was really looking at. Name's Rebecca Holloway, 17 years with Alaska Wildlife Troopers, currently working out of Bethel covering the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. It's flat country, mostly tundra and wetlands, harder to navigate than mountains because everything looks the same. No landmarks, no reference points, just endless variations of the same landscape repeated in every direction. People underestimate how easy it is to get turned around out here. Early April of last year, I got a call from a village coordinator in Nunapitchuk, small Yupik community about 50 miles west of Bethel. A subsistence hunter named Vincent Ayunerak had gone out 3 days prior to check his fish traps along one of the smaller rivers and hadn't returned. His wife had waited the first day, figured he'd decided to camp overnight. Second day, she started asking neighbors if they'd seen him. Third day, she contacted the village coordinator who called me. Vincent was experienced, born and raised in the Delta, knew the land as well as anyone. He'd taken his four-wheeler, basic camping gear, and his rifle. The route to his fish traps was familiar. He'd run it dozens of times over the years. Weather had been clear. No storms or unusual conditions that might have caused problems. His wife Emma said he'd been in good spirits when he left. Mentioned he might bring back some early-season pike if the fishing was good. I coordinated with local search and rescue volunteers from the village and headed out by Bush Plain. The pilot, a woman named Carrie, who'd been flying the Delta for 20 years, put us down on a gravel strip near Nunapitchuk around noon. Emma met us at the airstrip with 2 of Vincent's cousins, both of whom knew the area and had already done preliminary searching on their own machines. Emma was in her 60s, weathered and tough in the way Delta elders are, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She showed me the route on a map, a winding path along the river that led to a series of sloughs where Vincent maintained his traps. The cousins had followed the route yesterday, found Vincent's four-wheeler about 8 miles out, parked near the riverbank. Engine was cold, keys still in the ignition, but no sign of Vincent. They'd searched the immediate area, calling his name, looking for tracks or any indication of where he'd gone. Found nothing. The four-wheeler looked like he'd just stepped away for a minute, meant to come right back. His rifle was still strapped to the rack, his pack still secured to the rear carrier. Only thing missing was Vincent himself. I loaded my gear into one of the cousins' four-wheelers, and we headed out, following the same route Vincent had taken. The terrain was typical Delta country, flat tundra broken by countless small channels and ponds, everything still partially frozen but showing signs of spring breakup. The route was easy to follow, packed snow and ice creating a clear trail through the landscape. We reached Vincent's four-wheeler in about 45 minutes. It was positioned exactly as the cousins had described, parked at an angle to the river like Vincent had pulled up to check something and planned to be right back. I examined it carefully, looking for any signs of struggle or disturbance. Everything was normal, even neat. Not like someone who'd been in distress. I asked the cousins to show me where they'd searched. They pointed out their tracks radiating from the four-wheeler in expanding circles, covering maybe a half-mile radius. Standard search pattern, well executed. I could see where they'd checked the fish traps, which were all intact and had actually caught several fish that were now frozen solid in the traps. Vincent would have collected those if he'd made it this far. That detail bothered me. Vincent had come specifically to check these traps, had driven 8 miles to reach them, and then apparently hadn't collected the fish he'd found. The traps were less than 50 yards from where his four-wheeler was parked, easily visible from where he'd stopped. Why park there and not finish what he'd come to do? I walked down to the river, following what might have been footprints in the soft snow, though they were degraded enough that I couldn't be certain. The ice was breaking up along the edges, dark water visible between white sheets. I checked carefully for any sign Vincent might have fallen through, but the ice near the bank was still solid, and there were no holes or weak spots that would indicate an accident. One of the cousins, a man named Paul, came down to join me. He said he'd been thinking about the traps, about how Vincent would never have left fish sitting that long. Vincent was meticulous about his trap lines, checked them regularly, never wasted anything he caught. Paul said it didn't make sense unless something had distracted Vincent before he could reach the traps, something urgent enough to make him abandon his immediate purpose. I asked what could be that urgent out here. Paul shrugged, said maybe he'd seen something, heard something, decided to investigate. But Paul's expression suggested he was thinking about other possibilities, things he didn't want to say out loud. I'd worked with enough indigenous communities to recognize that look. There were stories about this land, traditional knowledge about places and phenomena that outsiders didn't always understand or respect. I asked Paul directly if there was something about this area I should know. He was quiet for a moment, looking out across the tundra, then said that some of the elders talked about certain places where the land didn't behave right, places where people got confused, where directions stopped making sense. He said his grandfather had warned him about a stretch of river near here, said it was a place where you could walk in circles without knowing it, where you'd swear you were heading one direction but end up somewhere completely different. Paul said he'd always figured it was just stories, ways to teach caution and respect for the wilderness. But he'd noticed that certain areas made him uneasy, made his internal compass feel off. He said he was feeling that way now, had been since they'd arrived at Vincent's four-wheeler. Like something about this spot was subtly wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. I took his concern seriously. People who'd lived their entire lives in the Delta developed instincts that were worth respecting, even if they couldn't be measured or verified through conventional means. I suggested we expand the search pattern, push further out from the four-wheeler, and see if we could pick up any trail Vincent might have left. We split up, maintaining visual contact but covering more ground. I headed northwest, following my GPS and marking my route carefully. The land was deceptive out here, small rolls and depressions creating the illusion of variation, while actually being fundamentally identical. I could see how someone might get disoriented if they weren't paying close attention. About 20 minutes into the search, I found the first marker. It was a small cairn of stones, stacked deliberately, maybe 2 feet high. It hadn't been there long. The stones still had snow on them, but it was fresh snow, not packed and weathered. I called the cousins over, asked if Vincent might have built it. They said possibly, but they couldn't think of why. Vincent knew this area, didn't need markers to find his way. We found 3 more cairns over the next hour, each one about a quarter mile from the last, forming a line leading away from the river into the open tundra. The 4th cairn was different. It was larger, maybe 4 feet high, and next to it was Vincent's hat and one of his gloves. The items were placed carefully on a flat stone, not dropped or lost, but deliberately positioned. Paul picked up the hat, turned it over in his hands. He said this was Vincent's favorite, a beaver fur cap he'd worn for years. Vincent wouldn't have left it behind voluntarily, not in this cold. I examined the glove, found no damage, no signs of struggle. Just a glove placed next to a cairn in the middle of nowhere. The trail of cairns continued. We followed them deeper into the tundra, each marker taking us further from the river and any recognizable landmarks. I was tracking our route carefully on my GPS, making sure we could find our way back, but I was also noticing something strange. According to my GPS, we should have been covering distance in a straight line, but the cairn seemed to be curving, bending in a gradual arc that didn't match what the GPS was showing. I stopped and checked my compass, then my GPS, then the position of the sun. They all agreed on our heading, but the visual evidence of the cairn suggested we were turning. It was a subtle dissonance, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, but once I noticed it, I couldn't unsee it. The land and my instruments were telling me different things. Paul noticed me checking my equipment and asked if something was wrong. I explained what I was seeing. He nodded slowly, said that was what his grandfather had warned about. Places where what you saw and what was real stopped lining up, where the land played tricks on your perception. He said we should be careful, that people who stayed too long in places like this sometimes didn't find their way out. We found the 5th cairn, and next to it was Vincent's jacket. It was folded neatly, placed on a flat stone just like the hat and glove had been. I picked it up, checked the pockets, found his wallet and keys. His truck keys, not the 4-wheeler keys which were back at the vehicle. He'd had his truck keys with him for some reason, carried them miles into the tundra, even though his truck was parked at home in the village. The other cousin, a younger man named David, was getting agitated. He said this wasn't natural, that nobody strips down in the cold like this, not piece by piece, not arranged so carefully. He said we were following something that wanted us to follow it, that Vincent had probably followed the same path and look where it had gotten him. David wanted to go back, call in more help, approach this differently. I couldn't entirely disagree with him, but I also knew we might be running out of time. If Vincent was alive somewhere ahead of us, losing daylight to go back and regroup could be the difference between finding him and finding a body. I made a decision to push forward for 1 more hour, to see where this trail led, and if we didn't find Vincent by then, we'd turn back and bring in additional resources. The 6th cairn appeared after another 15 minutes of walking. Next to it was Vincent's shirt. Just his shirt, nothing else, placed with the same careful precision as the other items. Paul picked it up, said it was still cold but not frozen solid. Vincent had removed it recently, maybe within the last few hours. That meant he might still be alive, might still be close. We moved faster now, following the cairns with renewed urgency. The landscape around us was becoming stranger, though I couldn't point to any specific feature that had changed. It just felt wrong, like we'd crossed some invisible threshold into a part of the delta that operated by different rules. My GPS was still functioning, but the readings seemed off, showing positions that didn't quite match where I knew we should be based on time and distance traveled. The seventh cairn held Vincent's pants and boots. He was down to his thermal underwear now, if he was still following this pattern. The cold was brutal, well below freezing, and nobody survived long exposed like that. I radioed back to the village, reported our findings, requested immediate helicopter support with medical evacuation capabilities. The coordinator said they'd scramble what they could, but it would take time. The 8th cairn was visible from the 7th, about 100 yards away across flat, open tundra. We approached it carefully, weapons ready, not knowing what we'd find. The cairn was the largest yet, nearly 6 feet tall, and at its base was Vincent. He was alive, but barely, curled in a fetal position wearing only his underwear, skin blue-white with cold. His eyes were open but not tracking, and he was muttering something under his breath, the same phrase repeated over and over. I couldn't make out the words. We immediately began cold injury protocols, wrapping him in our extra layers, getting chemical heat packs against his skin, trying to bring his core temperature up. Paul leaned close to Vincent, trying to hear what he was saying. After a moment, Paul looked up at me, his expression troubled. He said Vincent was speaking in Yupik, an old form of it that Paul barely understood, but he could make out enough. Vincent was repeating a phrase that roughly translated to, "I have to finish walking," or, "I must complete the path." I asked Vincent where he needed to walk to. His eyes focused on me for just a moment, and he raised one shaking hand to point past the 8th cairn. I looked in that direction and saw nothing, just more tundra stretching to the horizon. But Vincent was insistent, kept trying to point, kept muttering that same phrase. He had to finish walking. He had to complete the path. David moved around the cairn to see what Vincent was pointing at. He stopped suddenly, called out for us to come look. When I joined him, I saw what had grabbed his attention. On the far side of the cairn, invisible from our approach direction, was a 9th cairn, and beyond it, just barely visible in the distance, was what looked like a 10th. Paul helped me carry Vincent while David scouted ahead. The pattern continued, cairn after cairn, marching across the tundra in a line that seemed to curve in impossible ways. My GPS was completely unreliable now, showing positions that jumped and flickered, sometimes placing us miles from where we'd just been. The sun's position didn't make sense anymore either, seeming to move too fast or too slow. I couldn't tell which. We found Vincent's underwear at the 12th cairn. He was completely naked when we'd found him, which meant the underwear should have been at the 8th cairn, or maybe scattered along the way. But it was here instead, at the 12th, laid out carefully on the stones. The logic of it was breaking down, the sequence of events refusing to form a coherent narrative. Vincent had stopped muttering. He was staring ahead now, eyes wide, and he was smiling. Not a happy smile, but something desperate and relieved, like he could finally see something he'd been searching for. Paul asked him what he saw. Vincent didn't respond, just kept smiling and staring. The 13th cairn was different from the others. It was built in a spiral pattern, stones arranged in a way that drew the eye inward and made it hard to look away. At its center was an opening, a gap in the spiral that seemed darker than it should have been given the ambient light. And around the base of the cairn, pressed into the soft earth, were dozens of footprints. They were human footprints, bare feet, all pointing toward the cairn. Different sizes, different depths, spanning what looked like months or possibly years, based on their varying states of degradation. Some were fresh, some were ancient, but all of them converged on this spot, this spiral of stones in the middle of nowhere. I documented everything with my camera, while Paul and David held Vincent, who was struggling now, trying to move towards the cairn despite his condition. He'd found some reserve of strength, fighting against them, desperate to reach that spiral, to finish his walk. Paul was talking to him in Yupik, trying to calm him, but Vincent wasn't listening. The helicopter arrived, drawn by our GPS beacon, even though my unit was showing impossible readings. The pilot had to circle twice to find us, later said we hadn't been where the GPS claimed we were, that he'd spotted us by visual scanning rather than instrument navigation. We loaded Vincent aboard, and as the helicopter lifted off, I looked down at the cairns. From the air, the pattern was clear. The cairns formed a spiral, curving inward from the river to that final 13th structure. There were other spirals, too, dozens of them scattered across the delta, most of them too degraded to see from ground level but obvious from above. Ancient patterns in the landscape, marked and remarked over generations, drawing people inward to some central point that I couldn't identify. Vincent spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Hypothermia, frostbite, severe dehydration, but he survived. Physically, he recovered well. Mentally was a different story. He told the doctors he'd been following a path, that he'd seen markers showing him the way and he'd known he needed to follow them. Each cairn had demanded he leave something behind, a sacrifice of sorts, payment for being allowed to continue. He'd complied without question, stripping away his clothes one by one, driven by an overwhelming compulsion to complete the journey. He said when he'd finally reached the 13th cairn, he'd understood what it wanted. Not his clothes, not his possessions, but his name. It wanted him to give up who he was, to walk into that spiral and never walk out. He said he'd been ready to do it, had been about to step forward, when we'd arrived. Part of him was angry we'd stopped him. Part of him was grateful. But all of him felt incomplete now, like he'd started something that would never finish. The village elders came to see him before he was discharged. They spoke to him in private, and afterward Vincent seemed more settled, less agitated. One of the elders, an old woman named Mary, told me that Vincent had done something no one was supposed to do. He'd started walking the old paths, the ones the land uses to collect things it's owed. She said the land was patient, that it would wait for him to finish, and that someday Vincent would feel the pull again, and he'd have to choose whether to complete the walk or live with the weight of the unfinished path. I returned to the site with a full team, including cultural consultants from the village and a survey crew. We documented the 13th cairn thoroughly, mapped the spiral pattern, took samples of the soil and stones. We found nothing unusual in any scientific sense, just rocks stacked by human hands, footprints made by human feet, all of it explainable if you didn't think too hard about the pattern, about the compulsion, about why Vincent had walked 8 miles from his four-wheeler leaving fish in his traps to strip naked in below-freezing temperatures. The report I filed was factual and sparse. Subsistence Hunter experienced severe hypothermia and disorientation, engaged in paradoxical, undressing behavior consistent with late-stage cold exposure, recovered alive due to quick response. No criminal activity suspected. Case closed. But I kept copies of the aerial photographs, the ones showing all those spirals scattered across the delta. I marked their locations on my personal map, started tracking reports of people going missing in the area. Not all missing persons, just the ones that fit a pattern. Experienced locals, people who knew the land, found disoriented or not found at all. People who'd started walking and couldn't explain why. There have been 6 more cases in the past year. 3 we found alive, 2 we found dead, 1 still missing. All of them in areas marked by those spiral patterns. All of them displaying the same behavior. Stripping away possessions, walking with purpose towards something they couldn't articulate, feeling compelled to complete a journey they didn't remember starting. Vincent lives quietly now, sticks close to the village, doesn't go out on the land alone anymore. Emma says he wakes up sometimes in the middle of the night, standing by the window looking out toward the tundra. She asks where he's going, and he says nowhere, but his body is pointed toward the northwest, toward the place where we found him, and his feet are moving slightly like he's walking without taking steps. The elders say the land has always had paths that call to certain people, that some individuals are marked in ways others can't see. They say the paths need to be completed once they're started, that interrupting the walk only delays the inevitable. They say Vincent will finish his journey eventually, either by going back willingly or by being taken when the pull becomes too strong to resist. I drive past the turnoff to that area regularly, checking it off on routine patrols even though there's no official reason to. I've never seen the cairns again, haven't been back to the exact site since that day with the survey crew. But sometimes when I'm flying over the delta, I look down at those spiral patterns in the landscape, and I wonder how many of them are active, how many are calling to people right now, drawing them away from their ordinary lives toward completion of paths they don't understand. Vincent isn't the first person to start walking the old paths, and he won't be the last. The Delta holds thousands of years of human presence, thousands of years of people making agreements with the land, paying prices for passage, completing journeys that had nothing to do with getting from one place to another. Some of that knowledge was preserved in stories and traditions. Some of it was lost or forgotten. But the paths remain, marked in stones and earth, waiting for the next person who'll feel the pull and start walking. I think about Mary's words, about the land being patient, about it waiting for what it's owed. I think about Vincent standing by his window, feet moving in unconscious rhythm, counting down the nights until the pull becomes too strong. And I think about all those footprints around the 13th cairn, people who made it to the center of the spiral and took that final step that Vincent didn't take. Where did they go? What did they find? Are they gone entirely, or are they still walking somewhere, continuing journeys that have no end in any conventional sense? The questions pile up with no answers, just more reports, more missing persons, more spirals appearing in the landscape when I look closely enough. The official stance is that these are tragic but explainable incidents, people succumbing to the harsh environment, experiencing hypothermia-induced confusion, making fatal mistakes in unforgiving terrain. And maybe that's true. Maybe there's nothing more to it than that. Maybe the patterns I see are just patterns, meaning I'm imposing rather than meaning that exists independently. But I remember Vincent's smile when he was looking at that 13th cairn, the desperate relief in his eyes as he tried to complete his walk. I remember how my GPS failed, how the sun moved wrong, how the land itself seemed to fold in ways that defied conventional navigation. And I remember Mary's absolute certainty when she said the land was patient, that it would wait, that Vincent would finish what he started whether he wanted to or not. I'm still a trooper, still responding to calls, still trying to find people who've gone missing in the vast emptiness of the Delta. But I watch for the signs now, for people who seem to be walking with unusual purpose, for tracks that lead toward nothing but continue anyway, for the spiral patterns that appear in stone and snow, and the paths people walk without choosing to. The land is patient. It has all the time in the world. And somewhere out there, someone is starting to feel the pull, starting to notice cairns they didn't see before, starting to understand they have a walk to complete. When they do, when they finally give in and start following those markers, I hope they finish their journey. Because the alternative, living with the weight of an incomplete path, might be worse than whatever waits at the center of the spiral. Vincent knows. He stands by his window every night, feet moving slightly, body pointed northwest, waiting for the night when the pull becomes too strong and his feet start moving for real. When that happens, Emma won't try to stop him. The elders have told her it would be cruel. The path needs completion. The land is patient, but it always collects what it's owed. And me, I keep flying over those spirals, keep marking them on my map, keep responding when someone walks away from their life toward something they can't explain. Sometimes I find them. Sometimes I don't. But I always wonder if the ones I save are really saved at all, or if I'm just delaying the inevitable, extending the time they have to wait before they finish what they started.